Hi everybody, I'm Steph Harmon from Guardian Australia. A few of you are just trickling in now, but welcome to Guardian Australia's book club, the Women versus the Medical Industry edition. I'm very excited to be introducing our guests today, and I'm going to explain how this all works for anyone who's a first timer. But first up, I wanted to acknowledge that we are all on Indigenous land. I'm currently working remotely from northern New South Wales on Bundjalung Nation. Gabrielle Jackson, who's going to be hosting the discussion today, is in Wagga Wagga on Wiradjuri land. And our two guests, Kylie Maslen and Katerina Bryant, both live on Kaurna land in South Australia. I know you'll join me in paying respects to Indigenous elders past and present and recognising that this land was never ceded. A bit of information about these Zoom discussions and how they work. First up, they're interactive, so you're going to be part of it if you want to, but don't worry, everyone's muted for now. If you turn your screen to gallery mode on the top right corner, you can turn your cameras on and get a sense of how many people have joined us today. And if you open the chat on the bottom of the screen, you can type with everyone at the same time. So introduce yourselves there and chat to each other about your own experiences or any book recommendations you've got, or in particular, any questions that you'd like to see answered. Because if we see a question or comment that we like, one of our organisers is going to message you asking if you'd like to be on camera asking it of our panellists. Finally, we are live streaming this and recording today for a video that's going to run on The Guardian, so please keep it all nice. This is the 4th edition of Guardian Australia's book club, and today we have a very big topic we're discussing. So women's health, chronic pain, and the gendered, or we can just call it sexist, medical system. Last year, my colleague Gabrielle Jackson, a news editor at Guardian Australia, released her own book, Pain and Prejudice, A Call to Arms for Women and Their Bodies. She's joined by 2 Australian writers who have new books out this month. Kylie Maslen's Show Me Where It Hurts is a powerful collection of essays about living with invisible illnesses that have been brushed off or misdiagnosed time and time again. And Katerina Bryant's Hysteria blends memoir with historical analysis to explore how women have been silenced by the medical industry from the start. All 3 women have their own personal and painful experiences with these topics, and we're really lucky to have them here to talk to us about it. So I'm going to throw to them now. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Steph, for that lovely introduction. I'm very excited to be here today with Katerina and Kylie. All our books deal with illnesses that we have ourselves. So I thought we'd just start by saying what they are, because I think a lot of people here probably suffer from these conditions, and I doubt that all of you have had a chance to read all 3 books yet, but I hope you will. So my book, Pain and Prejudice, is about the chronic overlapping pain conditions that mostly occur in women, and that's because I have endometriosis and adenomyosis and was diagnosed with chronic fatigue syndrome as a teenager. Katerina, do you want to just introduce your book a bit?
Yeah, of course. So my book, Hysteria, charts my own experience in finding diagnosis and understanding for an experience called non-epileptic seizures. I view it, as well as some medical professionals view it, as a mental illness, and I talk about how it sits within the realm between mental illness and bodily experience, and how those 2 dual perspectives actually aren't as helpful as we once thought.
Kylie?
My book is called Show Me Where It Hurts, Living with Invisible Illness. I have suffered heavy, long and painful periods as a teenager and in my 20s. I have diagnosed endometriosis, polycystic ovary syndrome, bipolar 2, as well as complex mental illness. And those illnesses all overlap into each other through chronic neuropathic pain, specifically in my pelvis. So my book is an essay collection that uses pop culture references to try and explain what it looks like living with invisible illness on a day-to-day level, And some of those references include memes and online culture, Beyonce, Frida Kahlo, and other sort of literature, TV, and film.
When I started writing my book, or thinking about writing my book, I really didn't want to write about myself. I just found it so incredibly hard, even though that's ridiculous because the whole book is about how we need to talk about these conditions more. And I eventually did, but only after kind of coaxing from my publisher, please write more about you, please put yourself in here. And the thing that I really loved about both your books is that you just dive straight in. They're both so brave. And I just wanted to ask how you felt about writing about your body. Do you want to start, Kylie?
Sure. I mean, there were times during the writing of this book where it was quite re-traumatizing, going over some of the difficult times and events that I've experienced in the medical realm. But it was important to sort of publish these details to make those experiences cohesive for the reader, but also to give a really honest account of what happens to a lot of women or people who have a uterus in under medical care. So that difficulty came from a kind of raw honesty, but I felt it was incredibly important to write in that way because it's through not sharing these experiences or having these stories dismissed for so long that this cycle of pain and suffering has been allowed to continue. So I hoped that by being out in the open about my life, I could help to contribute to a breaking of this cycle.
Katerina, you wrote about mental illness. Did you find that difficult to tackle?
So I was writing the memoir parts of Hysteria as I was experiencing them in real time. So I would go to a medical appointment many medical appointments, and come home and think through what had happened and write about that experience. So for me, there was a lot of joy in writing, even in difficult, perhaps dehumanizing circumstances. It felt as a way to express myself when I couldn't speak it, but I felt I could write it. And then in a funny way, that's how I was able to communicate to my family, because I was able to show them what I had written, and they could really have insight into these unusual and often discomforting experiences. So there was a lot of joy in the writing process, although it's complex. But when it comes to publishing and with mental illness, disclosure is always really complex and can not only bring up emotions within me, but can bring about stigma. But in saying that, I think the hardest part was experiencing that stigma in real time in difficult interactions in medical appointments. So the writing and sharing of the book has been much more joyful than that.
And what were your literary inspirations? Was there anyone you read who really inspired you to work through it in that way?
So many. I felt during the time of writing the book, I was just reading and feeling such awe for these incredible women that have written about their lives and their bodies before me. So Fiona Wright is a big one, Siri Husford, Maxine Beneba Clark, Elin Sachs. They all shared a lot with me. And in terms of the book as well, I talk about women from history who did not have the opportunity often to write about themselves, but were able to advocate for themselves in really interesting ways. And that was a big inspiration for me.
Kylie, there's lots of inspiration in your book. I'll let you talk about it yourself. But the part that I found really fascinating was your analysis of Frida Kahlo's paintings. I wondered if you could tell the audience a bit about that.
Sure. So in 2016, I happened to be in Sydney when the Frida Kahlo Diego Rivera exhibition was on at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. And I had a really emotional response to that exhibition. I kind of just went out of interest, knowing like what a big figure she is in public consciousness, but I didn't really know much about her personally. But then in this exhibition, I saw photographs of her in bed, set up so that she could paint while she was recovering from surgery, one of her many surgeries. And a piece of hers called The Miscarriage Sketch, in particular made me incredibly emotional. It was such a visceral work. I have a postcard of it up by my desk here, where she's really kind of pulling apart the sections of her that she feels are no longer a part of her. And even though I didn't start thinking about a book for more than a year after seeing that exhibition, that experience would have a really big impact on me. And so I really wanted readers to have those sorts of transformative experiences as well. And so as I began to look more at her work and read more about her and research her political allegiances, I guess, and the work that she did in those spaces, combined with the work of people like Stella Young, this all kind of came together for me, and yeah, was incredibly important in creating this work.
And why, you touched a bit on this before, Kylie, but I wonder if both you and Katerina could answer it. Why did you think it was so important to tell your story?
My primary motivation was I knew how important this book would have been to me had it been available to a younger version of me, who needed to see her pain validated, but also like just to be able to hold this experience as like a tangible object. The kind of, when I first got my copies of the published book, like it was quite overwhelming to think like all of this really awful stuff that has happened to me is now is now in this thing that I can hold, and that makes it really real. But as well as to the people experiencing it, I really also wanted to reach people in the lives of people who experience this stuff, because it is so difficult to be able to express, particularly when the pain and illness is invisible and internal. You can't see what's happening, so it's really difficult to communicate it. And I hoped that by using these visible sources, or the pop culture that you could go and watch the TV show that I was talking about, for example, that would help to start conversations between loved ones and peers and colleagues and friends, and to help build empathy for people who also have invisible illnesses.
I've actually started rewatching Please Like Me after reading your book, and I'm watching it in a completely different frame of mind. It's really interesting. Katerina, did you want to respond to that?
Yeah, that was a wonderful answer, Kylie. I felt like for myself, the process of writing the book allowed me to contextualize myself within a powerful women's history of being seen as patients and having experiences that were not listened to or treated with respect. So that not only allowed me to see myself as not alone, but within this thread of women that stretch back hundreds of years, but also to see how that thread weaves itself into the institutional nature of patriarchy in the medical industry today. But the power for me was in feeling my experience was shared, and that women throughout time have had strength and ways of advocating for themselves. And I wanted to share this power. And that's why I wrote about 4 really interesting people whom I admire.
And we've got a question from an audience member. Chloe, are you there?
Hiya. Thanks everyone for writing your books. I think I've told all 3 of you that I love and stan all of you. So I'm currently also writing a book about living with chronic illness, and I'm very much going through the re-traumatizing situation that you mentioned, Kylie. So I was just wondering how you worked through that. Like, how did you sort of mentally cope with that? And do you have any sort of tips and tricks?
Hi, Chloe. I love and stan you also. I have a really great psychologist who is a health psychologist. So we talk a lot about the trauma of the experiences that I've been through, how to live on a day-to-day basis, being able to talk to her, and she also has endo and chronic pain, so she's really understands what I'm going through. But also on a day-to-day when I wasn't with her, it was I was highly motivated by this idea of reaching people who I knew needed this book, and that really kept me going a lot of the time. And I think also the fact that because of my pain and illnesses, I kind of work and live in a way of that we learn through pain management, that is a very paced way of going about your day. So I actually only work sitting at my computer for maybe 3 or 4 hours a day, and the rest of the day is spent reading or watching stuff that I can be resting at the same time. And so I think having that kind of limit on how much of myself I was going to give on any one day, that was also really helpful and stopped me from burning out. And the fact that I would then often go move to the couch and watch something like Lady Dynamite or Please Like Me, or these shows that I talk about in the book. A lot of them are actually quite funny as well. So it was a bit of kind of light relief, but also the validation of seeing myself having like thought and dived into these traumatizing experiences. That was actually quite a nice balm to that part of my day as well.
Katerina, did you want to respond to that?
I think that was a wonderful answer. I would just also say that I think understanding the publishing process itself is important and something that I wish I had learned a little bit more about so I could create space, because as you are editing, you have to go over passages again and again, and that can be re-traumatizing. Also the proofreading stage. So really allowing yourselves pockets of time and support networks for those experiences, and knowing that they're coming so you can brace yourself for that.
I should also add that Katerina went through this experience a few months ahead of me, and she was really incredible and reached out to me and said, this is what's ahead of you, make sure you plan accordingly, and I'm here if you need to talk about anything. And so I think if you're going to be writing about any kind of memoir, but particularly one that involves trauma, I think find a community or find people who have gone through that process that you can talk to. That has been really, even just knowing that those people exist, actually, it's really just nice. It's really supportive.
And we have a question from Anna now. Hi, Anna.
Hi. Pack of legends doing such good work. Sorry, my children are so loud in the background. My question was about the writing, craft of writing. How did you find the beats of a chronic illness narrative when it feels so much like a repetitive, endless ordeal?
Do you want to start, Katerina?
Sure. It does feel like a repetitive, endless ordeal. I think for me, anchoring it within a theme, so being able to mirror the four women from history with my own experiences and see how we kind of reflected each other helped. But also, as I was writing the memoir sections of the book in real time, that allowed me to shuffle through experiences without having the task of looking back upon a lifetime of experiences and trying to fish out the ones I wanted to use. So I think writing as you're experiencing helps. Unfortunately, I suppose, with chronic illness, the experiences keep happening. So there will always be more to write about. And I think it's so difficult. For the epilogue of the book, I was faced with looking back and thinking, and that was one of the hardest parts to write. And I think, Anna, you're just such a beautiful writer. We'll love whatever things you provide us with.
Kylie, how did you go about that?
Well, I guess my experience has a real chronology to it. So I think that kind of comes across in the book a little bit, but what I kind of focused on was, and this kind of came about sort of quite organically. Like, I didn't really realize until quite late into the process that this had happened. But there's a real through line in the book of my not having the language to talk about stuff, to having found that. And that kind of goes through my experiences and gaining diagnoses, but also having found these elements in pop culture where I was finding not instances that are inherently ableist or are just not true to my story. But yeah, as I kind of found more and more of myself in pop culture, I found the language to talk about myself more. And by the end of the book, I've also had a couple of years of significant psychology therapy with my psychologist, and yeah, again, I just her importance not only in my life but in this book is quite telling, I think, in being able to find that not resolution. I mean, as Katerina says, there's no resolution to be found, but there is a kind of place of building comfort for yourself and building a life for yourself that you're comfortable with, and that's kind of, yeah, that was kind of what I was building to, even though I didn't quite realize it.
Yeah, I think for me, I started off being so motivated by anger, and the first half of the book was pushed through just by, being so fired up about these unbelievable facts I kept finding. And then, anger only gets you so far. And in the halfway through, I had to start looking for solutions. I had to start looking for hope, because I had to channel that anger somewhere. And I did find pockets of hope, which I think we'll get to later. But for now, I just wanted to move on to sexism in medicine. And the thing that really angered me the most was that for ages I was kind of trying to figure out why so little was known about endometriosis and even less about adenomyosis. And when I started kind of realising that actually it's because medicine really doesn't know much about female biology at all, because they've never really studied it, that everything we know about human health is basically based on male bodies. That's human men, male animals, and even male cell lines. Was there kind of an aha moment for you, Kylie, that really motivated you, or angered you in some way?
Just to add to your point, firstly, it's when I found out about that testing, it's so wild that they won't even use female mice or rats in medical testing, because female hormones are seen as too too disruptive or too unreliable a source to be tested against.
Too variable is the word they use. Too much variability. They introduce too much variability into results.
Which, of course, is the thing you need to be tested for, right?
Yeah, exactly. If you're going to sell us the drugs, test them on us too.
But in terms of that point of anger, when I was in my early 20s, I had a really awful experience that I talk about in the book, which was my first laparoscopy, which is the surgery that you need to have to be formally diagnosed with endometriosis. There's currently no other way of clinically diagnosing you without that surgery. And I had this just really awful doctor. You can read about him in the book if you like. who was really dismissive, really rude, told me that I would be cured if I had children, which is not only false information. At the time I was very young and very vulnerable, and it was a really damaging thing to tell me. I won't go into it, but while we're here. But so from then on, that kind of spurred me to try and find out more answers. And it still took another 5 years for me to really get to a point of having a proper diagnosis of what was going on. But yeah, I know that experience, as awful as it is shared by lots of other people in some respect or other. So that was my point of anger, was in calling that out as being something that we really need to move past, because it's above the pain and trauma that I've had physically. Those sorts of experiences have also caused pain and trauma mentally.
And Katerina, your book is all about hysteria, which is basically shorthand for sexism in medicine. And you went all the way to Paris to find out more about it. I just thought this was a fascinating part of the book. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. So my book follows my own story, as well as the story of 4 women from history whose lives intersect with the diagnosis or label of hysteria. And so I went to the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris to try and understand Blanche Whitman. She was known as the Queen of Hysterics, and not much has been written about her beyond her connection to her doctor, Jean Charcot. And I wanted to go to a place where women were and experienced a lot of what I experienced, to try and understand them and to understand myself and my own illness. And as I write in the book, my own illness is spoken about a lot as a metaphor that if you understand it, you are then cured, which is not my experience and not many people's experience. But part of me was hoping being in the place and feeling a connection to Blanche would grant me some understanding. As I write, it did, but not in the way I expected. It kind of spoke to my own longing for community and sense of self and positioning of my own experiences where they could have meaning, which I eventually find. But it was a really interesting push and pull. Being in Paris feels so long ago now.
There's a couple of sentences you write in your book which just have gone over and over in my head. I can't get them out of my head. You write, while the word hysteria is somewhat gone from the medical textbooks, its aura of blame and diminishing of mostly women's pain remains. The word is gone, but its legacy remains when women enter the waiting room. And that just resonated so deeply with me. And I think it's something that hangs over every woman or other person with a uterus who has chronic illness and who suffers. And I'm lucky that I have a really wonderful GP, but she was on holiday once. And so I had to go to a different GP. And I told him all my symptoms. And the first question he asked me was, are you often anxious about your health? And I just got up and left, because I knew where that that was going from there. And so Kylie, I wondered how you felt about those words that Katerina wrote, and if you have felt that weight of hysteria on you as you sit in a waiting room.
Yeah, that quote that you read out really resonated with me as well. I have definitely had experiences, numerous experiences, where the idea of my pain and mental illnesses have been seen as, I've felt it as them seeing me as a hysterical woman, but they've labelled it in what is now the kind of contemporary replacement as being too emotional, or overly dramatic, attention seeking, all of these, like, wanting to talk about my stress levels, all of these things. And that kind of dismissal not only led to a late diagnosis of my endometriosis and chronic pelvic pain, but it also led me to not being diagnosed as bipolar 2 until I was 35, because so many of we knew that I was having depressive episodes because they would often tie in with pain, bad episodes of pain. But I always knew there was kind of something a bit more happening, and these like dismissals kept happening. So yeah, it wasn't until 3 years ago now that I finally received that, and I really put that down to this contemporary reading of Hysteria.
I think we've got another question now. Izzy, are you there? If she's not there, we might just, I'll move on to the next question.
Oh no.
Oh, hi Isabel.
Sorry. I tried to unmute myself and then I messed it all up. Sorry everyone, I'm super awkward. Hi, how are you? I guess my question, I'm doing a lot of writing about miscarriage, so that's where I'm coming from. And one of the things that a publisher said to me was, I'm not interested in reading about miscarriage. I very much doubt anyone else is either. And that was a female publisher. And it got me thinking a lot about writing and audience, obviously, which is so important. And thank you so much for pioneering in this space, because I think we're still not quite there in terms of everyone wanting to embrace some of these issues, and it's so important to see your books get published for people like me. I guess what I wanted to know is, it's really important to me that men read my writing as well, because it's so important, not just because they all have women in their lives, but also from a shifting policy perspective, because we all know that it's often men that are controlling the policies that affect women and women's health. So I guess my question is, how did you consider men, and was that part of your consideration, like trying to get men to pick up these books and read them, or do we just accept in a slightly depressing way that men just aren't going to be as interested in these issues and we should be writing solely for women? It's a depressing thing to say out loud, but it's crossed my mind.
Can I speak to that? I definitely had the gender spectrum in mind when I was writing the book. I definitely didn't want it to just be read by people who were also experiencing endometriosis or other similar conditions. It was really important to me that boyfriends, partners, husbands, doctors, bosses, colleagues, whoever, the people in the lives of those of us who are going through these sorts of challenging healthcare, that they could read this book and understand better what is going on. I was very mindful of writing in a very accessible voice, in a very accessible way, so that that wouldn't be, I was thinking about essentially what the barriers would be. So one was writing really openly, so people weren't having to guess what might have happened or put things together themselves. I wrote in a really accessible voice. So, I mean, part of that is just the way that I write anyway, but I was really mindful of not appearing overly academic in the sort of language that I was using. But also those pop culture references were a really important gateway for other people to be brought into these conversations, not just in a, hey, I watched that show, maybe I might read about it, but also in a, maybe that show or that film can be used as a way of bringing people to the book. So if a friend of mine who has read the book has then suggested that her partner watched Lady Dynamite, which is a really amazing way of describing what it's like having bipolar, then they might have a conversation about how that is so, and then come back to the book through sort of interest, having watched that show together. So yeah, I definitely spent a lot of time and consideration thinking how people just beyond me and people like me might be able to access the book in varying ways.
Katerina, did you think about that?
I definitely thought about access, but I did not think about men as an audience when writing. I wrote something that I thought to be true of my experience, and I hoped that my own descriptions of living with mental illness and the associated experiences with that would allow people a lens to inhabit my experience in a way. But to me, it was something I didn't really consider, which seems strange now. But I was, I think, so wrapped up in searching for women and non-binary people throughout the process of writing and reading outside of the men's lens of practitioners, especially throughout history. But even now, that I was actively moving away from that. Yet I have had men read the book and tell me that it resonated with them, which made me very happy too. But of course, I understand there is a difference between reproductive health and mental illness within those perspectives too.
It's something I thought about a lot, Izzy, when I was writing, and I didn't have an answer because I just wanted to write the book I wanted to write. And I think it's really sad but true that a lot of men are kind of trained not to listen to women's voices. And what really struck me was that so many doctors and physiotherapists and health professionals got in touch with me after my book was published and were really supportive, and maybe one male doctor. And I don't think it's because they didn't want to read it. I think they just didn't hear about it. And my my partner gave a copy of my book to his colleague, an anaesthetist, and anaesthetists deal with pain all day, so it's pretty important. And he said, "Oh, great, I'll give it to my wife, who's a GP obstetrician, who doesn't need the book, But the good news is that the male doctors who have read it have told me that it has changed so much for them, because they're not trained to understand the male bias of medicine. They don't know that the reason they can't fix all these women who come into their surgery or their practice is because medicine hasn't studied them and doesn't have the answers, because they don't understand the illnesses. And one male friend, who's a good person, had said to me, "Well, I've never had a fibromyalgia patient who wasn't batshit crazy." He said that to me once before I wrote the book. And after he read my book, he was like, "I just don't know why I never thought about it like that." He says it's changed his relationship with all his female patients. And now he can tell when a woman is finding it hard to say the truth, to be honest about her full range of symptoms. And he says he can get to the story much quicker now, because he recognises what's happening, and he doesn't just think they're crazy. Oh, she's basically, he doesn't call them hysterical in his mind, but this is how doctors are trained. And so I think that it's really important to get men to read these books. And even I've had people write to me who say they gave it to their male GP, and their male GP loved it because, he was reading something he's never been taught. And it is a new perspective, and just seeing things from a different perspective can often be really life-changing. So I don't know how we get men to read it, but I think it's definitely worth trying. And we also have another question now from Lindsay. Are you there, Lindsay?
Hello. Thank you, Gabrielle. It's wonderful to be in this company, and thank you, you wonderful young women, for bringing these issues to the fore and giving us an opportunity to talk about them. My perspective is as a parent of someone who's lived with overlapping chronic pain. My daughter is in her 30s now, but she developed difficulties when she was still in primary school. And she has CRPS, complex regional pain syndrome, for those of you who don't recognise that term. And that was triggered by a badly sprained ankle at a ballet lesson. Most people who develop CRPS get it after a very serious illness or a dreadful physical accident of some kind. As she's moved along through her life, she's been diagnosed with fibromyalgia, migraine, and more recently endometriosis and chronic pelvic pain. And just watching her make her way through her life leaves me, as you can imagine, on many a day with my heart in my mouth. I don't know how she does it. Part of my story is to tell you about my advocacy on her part through the education system when she was a child and a teenager. The education system was, pardon my vulgarity, shit useless. And I remember saying to them things like, "You've got signs all over the school about a child with a peanut butter allergy, but you cannot do anything for my child to help her get through school." So she left school with assessments, nothing that reflected the brilliant intelligence that she has. Since leaving school, she left our hometown and she said, "I've got to go, Mum, I can't be the sick kid anymore." And she moved to one of our major cities where she completed 2 degrees with honours off her own bat, working part-time throughout that time to support herself. So this life of constant pain is still there with her, but she has worked full-time and supports herself. And I'm just so immensely proud of her for that. I will get to my question in a moment. I want to make one more comment.
We've only got 10 minutes left, so I will ask you to get to the question.
Talk about advocacy and making complaints. I did advocate for my daughter many, many times. Can I just say, when you are looking after someone with chronic illness, or if you have chronic illness yourself, getting through each day is a major challenge, and there is very rarely energy left to climb those mountains of getting to do the right thing. My question is, what is the best way for those of us who love people with chronic illness to care for them and look after them? What are the things we can and should do, and what are the things we cannot and should not do?
Kylie, do you want to go first?
Sure. I've been asked this question a lot actually in the last few weeks. I kind of have three things. So my first is to really listen to the person who is in pain and let them kind of vent. Know that it won't be a neat narrative because our brains are often incredibly scattered, and some of us have cognitive dysfunction as a result of the pain that we're in, so finding words can be quite difficult, that sort of thing. But once you've listened, then go and do your own research and take that onus of explaining what things are or what illnesses are away from the person who is in pain. You can then go back to them and ask specific questions, but by doing as much research and advocacy as you can do yourself without taking the precious energy of the person who is in pain, that is enormous. And seeing my family do that has been incredible and makes me quite emotional, actually, the amount that they have taken on. And I think that once you start to do that, you also start to see who else doesn't have a voice or who else isn't being spoken about, and you start to see the intersectionality of the issues that we're talking about. So we know that a lot of these issues affect certain genders, or we're talking about gender today, but there are lots of studies in terms of people of colour not being treated being treated in ways that are quite abhorrent, especially trans people and people who are gender non-conforming have faced incredible and horrific questions and trauma in order to be treated. So I would encourage you, as you're doing your research on behalf of the person who is in your life, to also think about the other people who are affected as you're doing your advocacy. But in terms of like day-to-day, how you can help someone, I always say that essentially to do the opposite of what so many of us were taught to do on a netball court, which is just an open, here if you need, and to offer very specific pieces, very specific instances of help, such as, I'm going to the supermarket, is there anything I can pick up for you and drop by on my way home? Or when are you next seeing that doctor? I'd happily drive you to the appointment. Like, there are some real productive things that you can do. And it's often in doing those things that you open up a far more emotional conversation, or just being there at the time is just really useful. So sorry, that's a bit long-winded, but that's my advice.
I think advocacy is really interesting because as Lindsay rightly said, a lot of people with chronic pain or chronic illness do not, it's so hard to get through the day. There's no spare energy for lobbying or networking or getting out there. And so I think those of us with a platform really have an obligation to make sure that advocacy takes place. And I was asked, really luckily, was asked to speak at a pelvic pain conference last year. And it was just a room full of doctors and physiotherapists and nurses and people who really, really care about this stuff and who do provide help for people and who listen and who understand that the medical system and 10-minute appointments do not help people with chronic illness, and they want things to change. And so I've really spent a lot of time listening to those people and trying to help them get their message out. And it's a really symbiotic relationship for me as a journalist, because they can provide me with the facts. You know, they send me the studies and I can do that journalism. And I'm really lucky that I have the energy now. I haven't always had that in my life, but that I do have that platform now to be able to do that. And I think it's really important for people to understand that there are doctors who care and who can help them, and there are researchers who are studying this stuff. And so I think that that's where I ended in my book, on a note of hope after all the anger and despair. I wonder if you have anything to add, Katerina.
Yeah, just from a mental illness perspective, I think it is quite common for friends and family to encourage help seeking, which, while incredibly valid, is very difficult. And I think that's not acknowledged, just in terms of how expensive seeking help is, how inaccessible, and how often when seeking help, the processes you go through as a person experiencing mental illness can make the experience worse, which, as you were speaking, Gabrielle, is not very hopeful, but I think that is something really important to consider, especially with ideas like, are you okay? Going beyond that and understanding that the structures of the system for people experiencing mental illness is not accessible and not kind and not cheap. And I think that's just important because it allows family and friends to better support and rally around people, rather than question why help seeking isn't happening as they believe it should be.
Yeah, I think that the expense of having a chronic illness is something that rarely is discussed, but it's something that you both wrote about really powerfully in your book, and something I've experienced too. You know, I've spent everything I've ever saved on my health and kind of trying to be as healthy as possible, but that's just not possible for most people. We've only got 2 minutes to go, but I wondered if you wanted to add anything to that, Kylie.
Yeah, after I had that really horrible experience in my early 20s, which took place in a public hospital, I think it was a matter of days afterwards that I took out private health insurance. And I've had to have it every day since. There are still a huge number of gaps in terms of the cost of living for me. The complexities of my financial situation and my health means that roughly 2/3 of my income goes on rent and healthcare. There are some supports in place, but nowhere near enough. And I think particularly in a mental health space, there are lots of lessons that we can learn from this year in terms of healthcare offerings through coronavirus, or as a result of coronavirus, and they include increasing the number of rebated appointments with a psychologist to a number that is probably more achievable. Telehealth, where you can access a GP for free and at home. The accessibility of these things as well makes a huge difference for people in pain or with a disability. And I think it's this class perspective that makes me the most angry, I think, sometimes, almost more than gender, because it affects so many people. And there are so many barriers to the NDIS and to gaining support, government support for people who are in need. And in my mind, it's a humanitarian issue, and it's one that needs, that's the kind of advocacy that people like Lindsay were talking about that need to happen, because we don't have the energy to do it. And, you know, when we're talking about people on assistance who are skipping meals in order to pay for medicine, it's horrific. I just can't believe it's happening in a country like Australia.
We have to wrap up now, but Katerina, did you want to add something to that before we go back to Steph?
Sure. I would just echo a lot of what Kylie said. We view Australia as a place with a healthcare system that will look after everyone. But in my experience, if you have a mental illness, and particularly an illness that is not understood and the cause is still not understood, it's very difficult and expensive to access care. Yet things are slowly changing, and I think when you live with chronic illness and you are forced into adapting to new circumstances, you find ways to find care. And when you stumble upon, for me, a psychologist who in our first appointment said, I will not understand your condition as much as you do, but I'm here to support you. You feel such relief and joy, and you're able to keep on living. And I think that's a really important thing to hold on to. And with, you know, our 3 books, they do cover a lot, but they're also from certain lenses, which we've touched on. There is more women talking about this and advocating, and hopefully there'll be more change too.
Yeah, I can see some people in the chat talking about Medicare, and I just wanted to quickly finish by saying that Medicare is designed by kind of politicians who have mostly been men, and it's actually disincentivises the good treatment of these conditions. It's not that doctors don't care, it's that our system is set up to not give them time to care. Even when doctors do care, if they get a lot of chronic patients, they will be the lowest paid doctors in the community. So, you know, this isn't about doctors not caring. It's really about the way the system is set up and how research is funded too. But unfortunately, I think we could go on all day. We have to wrap up now. So I'm just going to go back to Steph. Are you there, Steph?
Yeah, I'm here. Look, I think I speak on everyone's behalf when I say that conversation was just fascinating, invigorating, enraging. Thank you so much to all of you, to Gabrielle, to Kylie, and to Katerina for such courageous presence today. And I don't think we've had a book club that's been as engaged in the comments in the chat as this one before. So I hope you get a chance to go through and listen to everyone. I mean, all of the participants shared their own stories, and that was extremely brave of all of you. And I wish we could have gotten to you all. I wish we could do this all day, honestly. But thank you, everyone, for sharing your experiences and your insights. We do this monthly. I can reveal now to those of you still in here that our guest next month is a big one. It's going to be Jimmy Barnes talking about his new book of stories. We will announce a little bit more of that soon. A big thanks to Australia at Home to hosting this. They're sponsored by Essential Media, Principal Co, the Centre for Australian Progress, the Community Council of Australia and Guardian Australia. And tomorrow's session is their fortnightly tech talk, which features Josh Taylor from The Guardian. So thank you, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thanks, Australia at Home, for hosting us. Thanks in particular to all of our amazing panelists and to all of you in the comments there too. Have a lovely weekend.